I bring you greetings of peace from Pasadena, from the faith communities there, including we have 2 Unitarian churches there, which I've been involved with in my housing justice work. So it's an honor to be here with you. Thanks to Pastor Susan for inviting me, and to Charles and Kathy for hosting Gloria and me in their home this week. Back in college in the mid-1980s, I had a friend named Tim. Tim was big. He had transferred into our school from another one where he had played offensive line for the football team. Tim had 2 brothers who he said were even bigger than he was. One of them had played offensive line for the old Houston Oilers in the NFL. He told me that one time his 2 brothers were driving through Georgia and stopped in Little Town at a restaurant where there was a sign in the window that said, "All the pancakes you can eat for 99 cents. So they went in and ordered the pancakes. They finished off the first stack of pancakes and ordered more. Then they finished that stack and ordered more, and they did that several times until the waitress told them they couldn't have any more pancakes. Surprised that she would so blatantly contradict the advertising in the window, they said, "But your window says all the pancakes you can eat for 99 cents. Without missing a beat, she replied, "That is all the pancakes you can eat for 99 cents. The moral of the story is there's always another way to read the text. Interpretation makes a huge difference. In fact, some people would go as far as to say that interpretation is everything. And this is especially true of the collection of books that we refer to as the Bible. There are many different interpretations of it, and how we do the interpretation makes a lot of difference. I grew up evangelical. Most of those years, especially the first part of those years, my family was Southern Baptist. Evangelicals in general, and Southern Baptists in particular, have a very specific way of interpreting the biblical texts. I now look back on the Southern Baptist dogma that I grew up with, and I think of it as the quintessential American religion. I think of it that way because it focuses so much on individual salvation. And sociologists often rank the U.S. as the most individualistic society on the planet, perhaps the most individualistic society in human history. My father was a pastor and a missionary, and whenever he would preach, he would have an altar call inviting people forward to be saved. As a result of that, I got saved twice. Many years later, I knew a man in Georgia who had moved there from New England, and he made the observation that everyone in the South has been saved at least twice. So I guess in that respect, I was a typical Southerner. The reason I did it twice was because I thought I'd done it wrong the first time. The first time I was just 5 years old. The second time I was much more mature, had grown in my theological understanding. I was 7 years old. And so at 7 years of age, I was able to do it the right way. As I recall, the difference was that at age 5, I thought I had to remember everything that I had done wrong and ask forgiveness for each individual thing. Whereas at the age of 7, I had realized that I probably forgot some things, and I could just admit to being a sinner and ask for blanket forgiveness. So that solved the problem. But then I ran into another problem. I started reading the Bible. If you've never read the Bible, you should be forewarned that it has a lot of crazy and problematic texts. Evangelicals of all stripes, as far as I can tell, are supposed to read the Bible and pray daily. So I started doing that, and I was very committed. Even as a child, I read and prayed daily. Years later, I would discover that a lot of evangelicals don't really do that, or at least not the Bible reading part. Or perhaps they read it very poorly because they don't seem to know or understand what's in it. Or when they do, it's all out of context. But there are always a few people that I knew growing up who, like me, were very committed and read the Bible regularly, if not every day. And most of them, if you caught them at the right moment, in a moment of honesty, if you asked them the question the right way in the right moment, most of them would admit that a lot of things in the Bible are really troubling. And that was the problem I ran into. There are a lot of crazy things in the Bible. Another thing I noticed was that the Bible was not really that focused on individual salvation. In fact, the concept of individual salvation, the way it had been taught to me, is rather hard to find in the Bible. Now, definitely there are verses here and there in the Bible which do seem to support the evangelical formula for individual salvation, if that's what's already in your head. And it helps if you read it in English, which does not have a distinctive second-person plural. So often when the Greek or Hebrew is addressing a group of people, it comes across in English as if it's addressing an individual. But even with all that, these verses are really scattered and quite few. And even as a child reading the Bible, I noticed that. But I soldiered on as a good evangelical Christian. But the thing that really troubled me the most was not that the Bible didn't seem to support the evangelical formula for individual salvation, or even that the Bible had a lot of crazy and problematic stuff in it. I mean, that was troubling enough. But the thing that troubled me most was the stuff I read in the Gospels that actually did make a lot of sense, but that was being ignored in the churches where I grew up. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with the Bible, there are 4 Gospels, and they each tell the story of Jesus. The first 3 are rather similar, but still have distinctive elements that the other 2 don't have. And the 4th Gospel is very different. It presents a different portrait of Jesus, but maintains the same storyline. I tell you that just so you can understand what I'm about to describe. The first 3 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have Jesus saying some pretty radical, countercultural stuff. For example, Luke's version of the Beatitudes that I read earlier in the service. Jesus says, "Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. Blessed are you who hunger now, for you will be filled. But woe to you who are rich. Woe to you who are well fed." In both Matthew and Mark, Jesus says that it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And 6 times throughout the first 3 Gospels, Jesus says, "The first shall be last, and the last shall be first." And this is what some scholars refer to as the great reversal. It is a hyperbolic way of talking about the social and economic flattening of society. Another way of saying it is, every valley shall be exalted, every hill and mountain shall be made low. You may recognize that from Martin Luther King, but King was quoting John the Baptist, who was quoting the prophet Isaiah. This radical message of turning society upside down or flattening it is all over the Gospels. It's really hard to miss. And yet the churches where I grew up were managing to miss it. Apparently central to many evangelicals' interpretation of the Bible is the strategy of ignoring Jesus' radical teachings. But I did encounter some evangelicals who talked about it and tried to live it out, some Anabaptists and Mennonites, and a group called Jesus People USA, a community in uptown Chicago. They used to have about 500 people sharing a common purse, and their central meeting room doubled as a homeless shelter at night, and during the day it was a cafeteria that fed the whole community, including 300 street people. There are evangelicals like that who do take Jesus' radical teachings to heart and try to live them out faithfully. But they are a minority, and those are not most of the evangelicals that I knew growing up. And yet Jesus' radical teaching about turning society upside down was the part of the Bible that I liked the best. And I tried to figure out how Jesus' teaching worked within the larger narrative of the gospel story, because that was a puzzle to me. The radical teachings of Jesus were obvious, but how did they fit in with the larger story about Jesus that included the crucifixion and resurrection, and, as I was being told, individual salvation? Part of my journey was to go to seminary, and there was one class where that was for me a watershed event in my understanding of the gospel narrative. I was taking an intensive course on the Gospels, and for some reason when the professor covered the Gospel of Mark, he presented a socio-political reading of the text. He didn't do this for the other 3 Gospels. I don't know why, but he did it for Mark, and suddenly the story just made sense to me as a unified whole. Suddenly I understood the narrative arc. It all fell into place. We learned things such as that the title Son of God in the first century was a title claimed by Caesar. So to give this title to a Galilean peasant was a challenge to Rome. We learned that Jesus and his disciples lived under a brutal Roman occupation, and that the high priest in Jerusalem at that time was actually appointed by Rome, making the government in Jerusalem a Roman puppet government. Finally, everything made sense. I understood that Jesus was leading a nonviolent movement, challenging Roman power, and casting a vision of a new society that he called the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, a new society where everyone would have enough. I didn't have all the pieces yet, but I had the general outline that I needed to continue this study, a study of the Gospels along these lines. So in my continued study, I realized that one reason so many of us miss the subversive socio-political dimensions of the story is because when it gets translated into English for modern people using religious language, that distorts it, because in the modern Western English-speaking world, religion is a separate category with its own language and concepts and institutions. But this was not true in the ancient world, in which the books of the Bible were written. In the ancient world, there was no concept of religion as a separate part of life. For ancient people, all of life was spiritual. So they didn't have separate religious words and institutions. We think of temples as religious. For ancient people, temples were part of the government. Priests were powerful political figures. So this different way of understanding the world is a barrier for modern Westerners trying to understand the texts of the Bible. And translators often make it worse by choosing specifically religious language to translate the texts. For example, the word righteousness. That's pretty much a religious word in our society. We don't use it much outside of a religious context. But the Greek and the Hebrew words being translated convey more the idea of social righteousness, or justice might be a better word. In fact, in Spanish Bibles, that's usually how it's translated, justicia. And I encountered also a class analysis of the gospel texts. So Jesus is not just leading any movement for a new society, he is leading a peasant movement, a rural working class movement. This makes a great deal of difference in how we understand a lot of the story, and also makes a lot more sense of many of the things Jesus said and did. So all of the study was what I was doing eventually resulted in my podcast, which Pastor Susan referred to, and which Charles and Kathy and Pastor Susan have listened to. Maybe some of you have, I don't know. But while I was working on this podcast, I started to notice something that I hadn't really seen before, and that I'd not encountered really in any of the scholarly literature, at least not to the extent that I was beginning to see it. And that is how profound the events of the years 66 to 70 of the first century were in shaping the Gospels. Most scholars agree that the Gospels were written in the late first century, and they were somewhat shaped by the events of 66 to 70, especially the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in the year 70. But it seemed to me, while working on the podcast, that the impact of those years was still being underappreciated. And then the genocide in Gaza began. And seeing the parallels between this current genocide and what happened in ancient Israel in the year 66 to 70 in the first century finally made clear for me this new revelation. The Gospels in the New Testament were written out of the experience of genocide. While the story that is told in the Gospels takes place before the genocide, in the early first century, the Gospels themselves were written down in the wake of the genocide in the late first century. Jesus and his disciples lived in the early first century in ancient Israel, ancient Palestine. They lived under a brutal Roman occupation that involved resource extraction, settlements, and what we would call today an apartheid system. And this eventually led to ethnic cleansing and genocide. Now, there were before that periodic uprisings by the Jews against Rome, but they were usually easily put down. And these uprisings are actually alluded to in the New Testament, but most modern readers miss them because we are not familiar with the history, and also because we tend to read it through a religious lens. So uprisings were common, but in 66, the year 66, the rebels were unusually successful. So if you've been following the events in Palestine for the last few decades, this should all start sounding familiar to you. A long, brutal occupation, a successful resistance action, followed by genocide. The Jewish rebels in 66 were able to take Jerusalem and hold off the Romans for 4 years. But the Roman legions came. They carried out a scorched earth campaign through Galilee and Judea, destroying Jewish villages, slaughtering many Jews, and taking other Jews as slaves. And then they laid siege to Jerusalem. And they cut off the food, creating mass starvation in Jerusalem. Sound familiar? When they finally crushed the rebels, they destroyed the city. Most scholars focus on the destruction of the temple, and that was very significant, but that is far from the only thing that happened. The Romans slaughtered many Jews, not just combatants, but civilians. They took many Jews as slaves, and according to the ancient Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, they crucified thousands of Jews on the hills around Jerusalem. It was after that the four Gospels in the New Testament were written. Anyone reading a story about a crucified Jewish Messiah in the late first century would have immediately thought of the thousands of Jews crucified on those hills in the year 70. Reading about the crucifixion of Jesus would have immediately brought to mind the crucifixion of Israel. It was common in ancient literature for an individual to embody a whole people. And there are strong literary clues in the Gospels that Jesus embodies his people, the Jewish people. When the temple was destroyed, Jews understood that event as their abandonment by God. God had abandoned them. They understood the temple to be where God dwelled in Israel. So it could only be destroyed if God allowed it to be destroyed by leaving it. In other words, God had abandoned Israel and allowed the Romans not only to destroy the temple, but to crucify them as well. In both the Gospels of Matthew and Mark, Jesus cries out from the cross, my God, why have you abandoned me?" In this story, written in the wake of the crucifixion of Israel, Jesus is crying the cry of his people. God, oh God, why have you abandoned us? Jesus' cry from the cross that God has abandoned him is the cry of the Jewish people during their crucifixion in the year 70. But the story in the end is not one of despair or mere victimhood. The story in the gospel is one in which the martyr is victorious over the empire that executes him. In the end, he rises from death in victory. In the end, life triumphs over death, love triumphs over violence, and the Palestinian Jewish peasant triumphs over the empire. If you listen closely to Palestinian people today, they are using the language of martyrdom. And not just for the fighters, but for everyone. Every Palestinian who is killed by Israel is a martyr. And lest you think that is only a Muslim thing, the Palestinian Christians are using the language as well, claiming their dead as martyrs. I was in the West Bank 24 years ago in the majority Christian town of Beit Jala. And I stayed with a Christian family whose father had been killed by the Israelis, and they referred to him as a martyr. So why do they do this? They do this because they refuse to be mere victims. They refuse to allow the deaths of their people to be in vain, meaningless. And they do this because in the end, the martyrs always win. This is the way they choose to interpret their situation. And interpretation makes a huge difference. In fact, some people would go as far as to say that interpretation is everything. The Palestinian people today, as the ancient Palestinian Jews in the first century, find themselves in a very desperate circumstance with a powerful enemy who is trying to annihilate them. And like the ancient Jews who wrote the four Gospels, they have chosen the interpretive framework of martyrdom. Let us also, in these very troubled and dangerous times in the United States, be very wise in how we choose to interpret not just our sacred text, but our current situation. Thank you.